Alright, welcome to Before the Pitch, where you can love New York baseball no matter what shade of blue you're wearing. I am Billy.
And I am Scott, and today we are going to be reflecting on the 2020 season from both the New York Mets and the New York Yankees. So, Billy, let's start with you and the New York Mets. How would you sum up the season? And then most importantly, where are we going from here?
Well, where we're going from here, that's going to be Big Uncle Stevie. But, to recap the 2020 season, I'll say it was a huge disappointment, You're talking about a season where almost half the league made the playoffs, and the Mets missed it pretty handily. Like, they were not even close to being competitive for a majority of the year. There were large glaring issues from starting pitching to, not getting hits with runners in scoring position. And we're just talking about like overall failure as a team. And I don't want to read too much into just 60 games, but it is kind of concerning, especially for the success that we had in 2019. Now, moving into this offseason, obviously, like the biggest and most important news that we have is that the team is officially sold. They're closing on the deal this week, and it's going to be owned by Steve Cohen, who's worth like $14 billion versus the Wilpons, who were just scraping the bottom of the barrel most years. So, you're talking about a huge swing in the ability of the organization to actually operate at a high level and in a high market now versus what we had in the past, which was always kind of sitting there going, well, if everything breaks just right, we might have a chance. Now you can force those things to break right by building depth, by building capital through the organization, where you can actually have a franchise that is worth something and not just hoping that everything breaks right every year. That's the big news for the Mets right now.
Yeah, and I feel like something you and I were talking about before we started streaming is what this actually means for the Mets in terms of spending, in the sense that I think we both agree the Mets aren't going to spend just to spend.
No.
All this means is money will not be an issue.
Yes, and especially...
But they're still going to be smart about how they're spending it.
Certainly, and especially when you think about who Steve Cohen is talked about bringing into the franchise, and that's an old friend of ours, Sandy Alderson. Now, Sandy Alderson is known as a GM that does not hand out mega contracts. But when he was the GM of the Mets previously, he didn't have the ability to hand out a big contract. So it's interesting to see a guy that prides himself on fiscal responsibility within a baseball organization having the ability to spend the money where he needs it, when he needs it, a little bit more. I don't want to say frivolously, but just a little more. If there's a player he likes, instead of being like, I don't know if I can go that extra year, or if I don't know if I can go that extra 10 or 5 mil that he wants because I need to buy like 6 other players with that other $5 million. Like, no, like the money's there now, and that's just something that he didn't have previously, and I don't want you to think that Sandy Alderson is just going to recklessly spend, because that's not the style of GM that he wants to be known as, let alone is going to provide for the organization.
So a couple minutes before we get into some of these people that we could be spending money on, Brodie Van Wagenen, I think we agree his role is adios. Correct?
Yeah, I would say it's highly likely that Brodie Van Wagenen will no longer be the GM of the Mets. Now, does that mean that he's not going to be part of the organization? I really can't say, but, by bringing in Sandy Alderson to be the president of baseball operations, as he's rumored to be, it kind of puts at least a an overseeing hand sitting above Brody, that will basically tell him to sit there and not do something, instead of just being like, that's a player I want, I'll do whatever it takes to get them. It'll be like, no, you're going too far, and we need to backtrack. So there is a responsible, and as something that I've said many times over the last few years, is that there needs to be a responsible adult in the room. Well, Sandy Alderson is a responsible adult in the room. And he always has been. I mean, the guy is a military veteran. He is a well-respected baseball guy. Like, he's been part of many different organizations, and everybody has nothing but good things to say about him. So I welcome him back, because a majority of the team that's on the field right now is a direct result of his tenure as the GM of the New York Mets.
Second name we got to talk about is Luis Rojas, the manager. I have not heard anything about him. You could probably give me as much information as we can about him. We do know that the Boston Red Sox, who are looking to probably bring back Cora, we know AJ Inch has a job again. Or do you foresee the Mets keeping Luis Rojas, or was he just a placeholder for whatever is coming in next?
So I would say that the biggest tell that Brodie Van Wagenen is not going to be part of this organization moving forward is the fact that AJ Hinch was not even in a conversation for being brought over to the Mets. Now, him and Brodie Van Wagenen have a very good relationship, as I believe, now do not quote me on this, but they knew each other in college, or were roommates in college. Something along those lines. They had a very good relationship with each other from the time they were very young. About the time you and I met, for that matter. But so I think that's a biggest sign of Brodie not being part of the organization moving forward, or at least them not willing to make a change within the managerial position. I would say that Rojas's job was safe. I don't see any issues with anything he did this year. As a matter of fact, I think he was very controlled, very rational, very honest with his responses with when he believes that he messed up on something versus when something just didn't break the right way for him. And I think that says a lot for a guy that has never really been in the spotlight as a manager before, and really hasn't managed above like the minor leagues before. And I think that moving forward is strong leadership skills, as well as good relationships with the players, that they trust him to be the voice of them outside of the clubhouse.
Now, as of right now, it appears that the National League is going back to not having a DH, at least for next year, which means that's one less hitter that the Mets would need, although maybe not, because you would think they'd still be preparing for the DH that would come in future years after next year. There have been some articles and some ideas floating around of the possibility of the Mets trading Pete Alonso and committing to Dom Smith at first base because of what this past year says. How much stake do we put into the numbers of a 60-game season?
Very little. A lot of guys... there's a lot of baseball players out there that are extremely streaky hitters, right? So what affects a streaky hitter the most? And that's when they get put pressure on them. And I feel like Pete came into this season with a lot of pressure on him. He put a lot of it there himself, as well as the fans, and the city, obviously. It's New York City. There's always pressure. But, Pete sat there, and I think you saw the glimpses of what he did the previous year throughout the course of the season. It just never really seemed like he took it and ran with those glimpses. It was kind of like he would get a couple home runs in a few games, and it would look like he's got his stride back and like he's comfortable at the plate, and then all of a sudden it would flip back into like that cold streak of his. Now, I don't want to call Pete a streaky hitter because, I don't think we've seen enough of him over the course of less than a year and a half's worth of baseball to say that he's a streaky hitter. In 2019, I would say he was a very consistent hitter, for that matter. So, you know, a lot of guys can get their season made in just like a month span. You can have a guy that rattles off 15 to 20 home runs in the span of 2 months, and all of a sudden, a 6 month season turns into a 20 home run, 25 home run season in the span of 2 or 3 months. And so like that's where the numbers can be so skewed in such a short season. But I don't think there's nothing to read into there. I think there is a little bit of like pitchers figuring him out a little bit, there being a scouting report on him, but now comes where you make your big league career, and it's make the adjustment. Like pitchers have figured you out. There's a bit of a playbook on you on how to get you out. Now you got to make the adjustment back. So, maybe there wasn't enough time in a 60-game season for him to figure out what that adjustment was, but maybe there will be in a 162-game season. So I wouldn't read too much into it. I do not think that there should be any stock put in any report where they're shopping Pete Alonso. You're talking about a guy that rattled off over 50 home runs in a previous year and still hit a decent amount in a season that he did not perform. Let's make that very clear. Like, he hit a decent amount of home runs in a season that generally is considered a down season or a bad season for him. That's not a player you give up on. At least not this quickly. And now, I'm not trading Dom Smith either, don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot more commitment to getting Dom playing time. I think that's a must for the Mets, but I don't think that it's him or Alonso. I think it's him and Alonso that needs to be the focus. How do we get him and Alonso in the lineup?
So, since we know we are not giving up on them, or at least you wouldn't give up on them, let's shift into some people who we might bring in to look up to and bring bright days for the New York Mets. There are some handful of people who you can sign and a couple guys who you can trade for, and there tends to be a lot of crossover between the Yankees and the Mets this year as far as people who they can both be targeting. So let's start with the Mets and use that to segue to move over into the Yankees while we talk about some of these guys and who they are. So which ones of these guys do you see the Mets specifically getting, or which ones do you see them specifically not getting?
So the biggest issue of the Mets this past season was starting pitching. There are plenty of options this season, and I think starting pitching needs to be a priority for this team, because you look at the free agent class going into next offseason, and there's a lot of position players, but not a lot of pitchers. So that means that we need to focus on fixing our pitching now and not just hoping that the guys we're getting back, like Syndergaard and someone like David Peterson repeats their performance. We can't really bank on that, because that's what we've been banking on for the last few years, and it just hasn't really worked out the way we've wanted it. So pitching is a priority. Now, the pitchers that I think we should focus on needs to be one of what I'm calling the big three out there, which is Trevor Bauer, Charlie Morton, and Marcus Stroman. Now, with Marcus Stroman, there's a little bit of a caveat to it, because we do have offered him the qualifying offer, which in a season like this is very interesting and enticing for a lot of players, taking a guaranteed $18 million just by signing a piece of paper. You don't really know what you're going to get on the open market this year. It's going to be a little hit or miss at times. Now, with, like I said, Uncle Stevie coming on board, is he going to want to make a big splash? In which case, that's going to be the Bauer move. Like, 1-2 punch, DeGrom, Bauer. Then you're talking about filling in the back end of the rotation with a Syndergaard, a Peterson, a Lugo, maybe another free agent, more of like the James Paxton, Robbie Ray type, someone with a lot of potential that maybe hasn't fully succeeded recently. That could definitely be an option if you go the big bopper route and go into Bauer and, try and create that dynamic 1-2 punch of a DeGrom Bauer type dynamic. I wouldn't go that way. I think the better option is to spend like maybe a similar amount of money that you would spend on Bauer, but spread it around a little bit more. So you're talking like the Charlie Mortons, the Marcus Stromans, and then bringing on more of the position players like a George Springer type. Maybe going after James McCann instead of a JT Realmuto. Bring in a quality, very good players that might not cost you as much because you can build a better team instead of just getting one superstar. Like we talked about earlier, there's going to be responsibility in how we spend our money, but not that we're not going to spend money.
Out of all those names that you just mentioned, which one of those is the most likely to be a New York Met by opening day?
George Springer.
Nope.
I think it's George Springer, and if I had to put a second name on it, it would be either Marcus Stroman or James McCann. I think catching is a priority for this team because we've always built ourselves around pitching. And with the backstops we've had over the last couple of years, defense and good catcher isn't really what's been mixing for us. James McCann is a decent balance of a decent offensive player, not to the level of Realmuto, but a decent offensive player and a good defensive player. So I think there's a good balance there, not going to cost you as much. Like I said, we're not shopping the bottom of the barrel. This is still a very good player, but not quite a, quote, superstar. And I think that's more of what you're going to see with the Mets is like, we're going to spend money. We're going to take out some names that are up there on the free agent list. It just might not be that top guy every time.
So names that intrigue me a lot. I think we're going to talk about this guy because this is the guy who you and I had talked about. It would be the obvious pick that the Mets should be getting. It doesn't look like it's as obvious should be this person anymore as someone who specifically said not to get JT Realmuto. I think there was a point in time where you and I are both like, this is a must-get guy for the Mets. He is no longer that guy. I think I know where he's going to end up. So where do you think he ends up?
If I had to guess, I think he ends up either with Washington or back in Philly.
My guess is back in Philly, and I actually predicted that before the reports came out where he said he didn't want to play in New York and he might want to stay in Philly.
I don't read into those reports too much, to be honest, because there were similar reports of Garrett Cole last offseason not wanting to play in New York. Like I honestly think it's just a negotiating tactic that comes out this time of year every year with players who are bound to get big contracts to try and pull in some of the more wealthy teams, the Mets being one of them, the Yankees being one of them. I think it's more of a negotiating tactic to pull in those wealthy teams to maybe put in a higher offer to begin with, to be like, hey, we want you, instead of like a competitive offer but maybe not the top offer. They want those high valued expensive teams to really put in a strong offer to begin with to help drive up the bidding of how much it's actually going to cost to sign this guy, especially in a year where I think the market's going to be a little bit depressed and you're going to see salaries a little bit lower than typically you would expect for certain players of certain calibers.
So the reason why I think JT stays in Philly is because I think the Phillies are under more pressure to keep him than anyone else is to get him, because like we talk about the Mets being great fit for him, the Mets have so many other priorities where, as good of a fit as he is not replaceable but band-aidable.
And like I said, if
band-aidable, and he is not band-aidable for the Philadelphia Phillies.
Yes, and like I said, if you can put like a James McCann behind the plate and upgrade to like a George Springer in center field and maybe like a Stroman and a Charlie Morton type player like into the rotation, that's going to provide you with significantly more value, I think, than just adding JT Realmuto. Um it's a game of where can I get the best upgrade, and I think it comes from upgrading to a smaller degree, but in multiple positions. Because, God forbid, you sign JT and he gets hurt in the first month of the season. It's like, oh my God, our biggest acquisition just went down. Now we're in the same boat we were in last year. It's like, but if you sprinkle that around to a Morton and a Stroman and a Springer and, a McCann and maybe like a Liam Hendricks or a Brad Hand, like if you sprinkle it around to a bunch of these different areas where it's like you're significantly increasing the depth of your team as well as the talent on your team, but you're getting more of it, there's less likely that all of those pieces are going to fail than just that one piece fails. And I think that's maybe like a smarter way to go about it. Especially when you have the money. It's like there's no question that the Mets can sign George Springer, James McCann, and like Brad Hand. There's no question that they can do that. They have the money now. It's just a matter of what gives us the best opportunity to win.
So, Trevor Bauer, where do you think he winds up? I have a prediction for where he winds up that I have not heard one person talk about, and I'm genuinely shocked that no one's bringing up this team that I'm going to name. But I want to see what your prediction is first.
I can see him going to a couple teams. I can see him ending up in the Dodgers organization, just because they're so like pitching is everything to that organization. Walker Buehler, Clayton Kershaw. You look at the AL Cy Young candidates for this year. 2 out of them are ex-Dodgers. Like the Dodgers are always an organization that's prided themselves on pitching, especially in recent years, and that's what's ridden them to so much success, I think, over the last like 5 or so years. So I could see him ending up with the Dodgers. He's not going back to the Reds. That's no question. I could see him maybe ending up with the Cubs, but not likely. Honestly, like, I think he's going to end up in Houston.
That would be my worst nightmare.
I think he's going to end up in Houston somehow, which is ironic considering how outspoken he's been against them. But for some reason, I feel like he's just going to Houston. I have no reason behind it, but I think that's where he's going.
So my prediction is the Anaheim Angels. And the reason why is because this is a team that was balls deep into Garrett Cole. And they would have gotten Garrett Cole if it weren't for Cash saying, fine, I'll give you that 9th year in New York. That was the difference maker. If it wasn't for that, Garrett Cole was going to the Angels. But the Angels' biggest problem is the Angels do not have starting pitching at all. And they are wasting Mike Trout. They are wasting Anthony Rendon.
Yep.
The Angels need a saving grace.
And they've already wasted Albert Pujols.
Yes. Yeah, and him too. The Angels need a saving grace and a starting pitcher. They have expressed it multiple times. They need starting pitching. They've done it many. Remember, they got C.J. Wilson. That was the thing like years ago, and it didn't turn out. Because that's what happens in Anaheim is you don't turn out.
I think they'd be better. If you're asking me, I think Anaheim would be better off signing the likes of Morton, Paxton, Tanaka. Pair up the two Japanese stars. Like
you talk about the Angels, they keep talking about what about Tanaka. I think Tanaka stays in New York, but that's a name that keeps coming up there.
I think it's time. Yeah. No offense, but I think the Yankees have a tendency to hold on to their players a little too long, and I think if they go back to the well on Tanaka and Gardner again, that's just kind of like I just think there's so many better options for this team. That's A, not going to cost them as much, and B, just like work better for the organization. But we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah. So my last closing thing on the New York Mets is I think there's a player on another team who the Mets can be trading for.
I think there's 2.
Do you know which the one that I'm thinking of is?
Um, is it Nolan Arenado?
It is Nolan Arenado. It is Nolan Arenado, and it just makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
So here's the thing, right? You're gonna have to give up a lot to get him. But you're also in the power position as the team trading for him right now, because the Colorado Rockies owner has basically come out and said, we cannot pay this man.
Mm-hmm. And they haven't directly said it. They've just said it in invisible ink.
Basically, like you shine the black light on it a little long and like it shows up. But so he's basically come out and said that we cannot pay this man, and every team out there knows it. The difference is, I don't know how many other teams can pay him as well. One of those teams
still need a third baseman.
Well, so now this is where it all gets tricky, right? Because now you're talking J.D. Davis, Jeff McNeil, Dom Smith, Pete Alonso. Like, this is the conversation again that comes back around where it's like, well, who are you giving up and who are you getting? I think if you're going to make that deal for Arenado, you have to consider the fact that one of those guys will no longer be with the team. That is without question. One of them's going to be gone. You're talking a top prospect. You're talking the likes of a Gimenez, or you're talking the likes of a Ronnie Mauricio. Guys that you really don't want to be giving up. But if you're getting the likes of a Nolan Arenado, you gotta be thinking about it for sure. If it was up to me, I would be willing to do a package of probably Rosario, Mauricio, and Davis. I don't know if that's enough, though. You might have to throw in one of the young pitchers that's in our organization as well to get it done. But I think that's a good starting point for a deal for Arenado, like Mauricio, Rosario, and Davis. I think that's a good starting point, because realistically, Arenado anchors third base, like that's without question. McNeil can play right or left field depending on, how you want to do it. Smith can also play left field, but the thing that really gets Smith in the lineup is having McNeil at third base. If there is a DH, that helps a lot because you can DH someone like Cano or Alonso and get McNeil and Smith in at first and second base. But it gets complicated, but it's a good problem to have. Let's be straight about that. It is a very good problem to have, and Arenado is a guy that I would give up almost anything to get it done, as long as it doesn't completely erase our farm system. And I think there's a way that you can do it that is not going to completely damage your farm system, because you need your farm system potentially for other things, as well as you need young players. It's just that simple. The other player that I was thinking about is Francisco Lindor. Now, this would be a trade and sign type of deal going on, because he is a free agent at the end of this season. But as we saw with Mookie Betts, it's like, if you trade for him, you get first shot at signing him. They can keep the price down by doing that too, because he doesn't hit the open market. You're not bidding against anybody. You're only bidding against yourself. I tend to like the idea of Lindor a little bit more than the idea of Arenado, for the fact that Lindor is still so young that you sign him to like a 8 or 9 year deal right now. You're not talking about a player that's in almost 40 years old. You're talking about a player that's going to be in his mid-30s. That's a big deal for me, because you're talking about length, you're talking about having a player in their prime for longer. also you put him at shortstop, and I think the team just kind of works a little bit better around adding someone at shortstop instead of adding someone at third base. I think we have plenty of people who can play third base, where, Gimenez is still a question mark. It was only 60 games that he played this year. And even less because he wasn't even with the team the entire time. And then you have Rosario as well, which is also a question mark. So, you're talking about a very young player in Gimenez and a player that just hasn't really proven it yet in Rosario that you'd be replacing versus bringing in an Arenado type that's replacing a Davis or a McNeil at third base who have been proven to be productive players for you. I think we upgrade better at shortstop than we do at third base.
Cool. That is all we have today for the New York Mets as far as the recap of the 2020 season. Most importantly, where we go from here. If you're interested to see how we evaluate the Yankees and where they go from here, you can see that in the next video that we are posting right up here. And you're not going to want to miss that, especially if you're a Yankee fan. There is a lot going on here. Billy, thank you very much for your time. I shouldn't be thanking you. This is your show, actually, believe it or not.
This was my portion of the show, man.
Yeah, you're right. So I should be thanking you. So that has been this installment of Before the Pitch for You Can Love New York Baseball, no matter what shade of blue you are wearing. And last thought, before we talk about shade of blue, is there a chance Uncle Steve brings maybe a shade of black?
I saw those Dallas Star jerseys recently with like the black with the bright neon green. That color right there, the little orange, black, bright orange, like, I feel like you could do something like that with that neon orange just popping right off the black. Maybe just like a hint of a blue in there. Like, I feel like you could do something awesome that tributes this style, but is so much more modern and so much more like, I want to say young. And not like, because this feels a little nostalgia at this point. Like it's been like 20 years basically since this debuted, so it feels a little older now. But you could do something that's maybe like bright orange or maybe like a neon blue or something in that similar like style as the Dallas Star jersey that was so popular all of a sudden. I don't know. He's a guy that's got a lot of unique tastes. So maybe the black was one of the tastes that he liked. Because if they are, they're coming back.
If this conversation makes you salivate for some delicious jerseys, don't worry. We do have a video coming up very, very soon about jersey branding in baseball, specifically the major leagues. And we are going to go off because I think there are so many different problems that baseball faces as far as jerseys and getting them really going. And Billy hinted at one of those biggest things that we said the word young, which I think is very important. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you guys very, very much. We will see you guys very soon in the next episode. Make sure to comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share. Thank you again.